Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 5 of Studium, an arts and humanities podcast. I'm John Sozak. In this episode, we feature a conversation between our own Dr. Tarishi Verma, Assistant Professor of Communications here at Albertus Magnus College, and Dr. Sandra Faulkner, Professor of Communication at Bowling Green State University. We are very glad to welcome Dr. Faulkner to Studium. In her work, Dr. Faulkner has built bridges between the social sciences and the arts. Maybe most notably, she's done much to advance poetic inquiry as a method in the social sciences. Her students use poetry, the visual arts, and creative writing to express their ideas and the findings of their social scientific research. Dr. Faulkner's own poetry and images have appeared in a variety of publications, and she is the author of 4 poetry chapbooks and more than 60 book chapters and articles. In her conversation with Dr. Verma, Dr. Faulkner shares about her own intellectual formation, how she uses poetic inquiry in her teaching, the relationship between research, activism, and justice, and much more. We're very glad to bring you this conversation between Dr. Tarishi Verma and Dr. Sandra Faulkner.
Hi, and welcome to our latest edition of the Studium podcast. Today we have with us Dr. Sandra Faulkner. Hi, Dr. Faulkner. I am going to briefly introduce Dr. Faulkner for all our listeners here, and then we will move on to a brief question-answer session about all of the work that Dr. Faulkner does. She's a professor of communication at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Her interests include qualitative methodology, poetic inquiry, and the relationships among culture, identities, and sexualities in close relationships. In her research, writing, and advocacy about close relationships and relational communication, she incorporates theory and research from a variety of interpersonal, sexuality, health, feminist, and cultural literatures to interrogate sexualities, identities, and relational expectations and forms. She focuses on the role of culture, discourse, and identities, and how these influence relational processes and understandings. So, welcome, Dr. Faulkner. Thank you so much for being here with us. How are you today? How are you doing?
I'm terrific, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Of course. So let's start with talking a little bit about yourself. My first question is, how did you get into academia?
Well, I always liked school, so I was a good student. And it was really in my master's program, I was doing a thesis, and I realized during then that I really liked research. And even then, I wasn't sure, am I going to, go on necessarily for a PhD or, what am I going to do? But then I did, and it was when I was in a postdoc, actually, after my PhD, that I realized that I was really meant to be a teacher. So it was like the research and the teaching through those experiences came together.
I love that. And so you're talking about that, it coming together. So that kind of takes me to, can you tell me a little bit more about your research methods? Because, just to give a little bit of context, I have taken classes with you, and poetic inquiry was the first time that I heard with you in 2017. And it kind of blew my mind because research is always so harsh and so strict with its terminology. So tell me a little bit about your research methods.
Right. Well, I actually did a quantitative study for my master's thesis.
Wow.
And so I was during my graduate career, I was in a program that was pretty dominated by quantitative methods. And so, I had done my master's thesis, but then it was in my PhD program that I realized that the kinds of questions that I was asking lent themselves more to qualitative approaches. So I was I was interested in people's experiences and their stories and their perceptions. So, I ended up doing a qualitative dissertation. Now, the poetry was not there at that point. It was a pretty traditional qualitative piece. But, I ended up actually doing a postdoc. So I had a tenure track position for a year, but then I quit and went back to do a postdoc for 3 years. And that's when I ended up studying narrative and narrative methods. And also during that time, I was taking some poetry workshops. And so even then, it wasn't in the community, and it wasn't that I had necessarily put it all together then. It took me a few more years to kind of incorporate poetry into my work. And, I ended up publishing an article during that time where I had written the methods section as a series of poems, right? And so that was one of the first kinds of forays into there. And then I used poetry to represent a series of narrative interviews I had done on being LGBTQ and Jewish. And so I had kind of a more traditional qualitative write-up of that, but then I also had a series of poems that I had published. And so it was kind of during that postdoc that I started to think about using poetry in my social science work, but I was really puzzling out how to make social scientific language poetic, because that was really the conundrum. So I was, taking poetry workshop, and I've always written poetry, by the way. So, that's something that has always been a creative practice of mine. So it wasn't like, poetry just kind of fell out of the sky. And so I was really trying to puzzle that out. And, unfortunately or unfortunately, during that time and a few years after, I think I've come to realize that social science language is not poetic. So whenever I do a project, I try to think about what are the most important concerns, right? Is it the epistemic concerns of the research, or is it like aesthetic concerns? And, there are ways to incorporate poetry into your work where it can work on both levels.
That's lovely. That's lovely. And so, and I know that I hope that after listening to this, a lot of people do go and Google what poetic inquiry is. But how would you describe the method in your own words? Like, how would you define it, I guess?
Yeah, it's the use of poetry as social research, in social research, and for social research. So researchers can use, poetry in a variety of ways. So you can represent interviews, for instance. You can use poetry as data analysis. It can be a part of a project, or it can be an entire project. And so it's really a method of turning research interviews, transcripts, observations, personal experience, and reflections into poetry or poetic forms.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So having taken your feminist theory class, I actually loved the approach that we had in our class, where we expressed our ideas on some of the feminist theories that we had learned through art. And that's a form that does not find itself very much in graduate or even the undergraduate classrooms. So can you elaborate a little bit on how poetic inquiry impacts your teaching and what role it can play in pedagogy?
Yeah, since I started doing poetic inquiry, and poetic inquiry is a form of arts-based methodology, research, and it certainly also can be part of pedagogical practice. And so I had started to incorporate poetry exercises into the classroom, and I've found that it really has enriched my teaching. So and I don't just use poetry, by the way. So I use other kinds of art-based methods, right, or forms, such as, visual arts, other literary forms, such as creative nonfiction, fiction, personal narratives, right? And what I found is that when I have students I sometimes we'll have them read poetry or short stories or creative fiction, and then, we respond to it in terms of whatever the course topic is. But I also have them write their own poetry and creative nonfiction and make their own videos. And when they're able to articulate things about their own lives and experiences in forms that speak to them, because many of them do write poetry, or they draw comics, or they like to make TikTok videos. these are all ways, right, that speak to them, but then they're able to express some things about their lives. And I'm always wowed by what students come up with when they use, these. And I have some examples, maybe this might be helpful as well, of how I've used poetry, for instance. So in a family communication course that I've taught, I've had students interview 2 or 3 family members, right, about stories that they kind of remember from their lives. And, students can also ask other kinds of questions. Well, then the students write poetry that presents, right, those stories of the family. And they're, able to use photos if they want, as well as the poems. And so what they're doing is they're telling some of these family stories in verse. And I find that, students are a bit challenged, but that they come up with terrific poetry.
I love that. And I totally understand that not a lot of people are immediately going to be very drawn to poetry, but I think that pushing that a little bit in class really helps. And I think the one thing that I learned from your class, one of the styles of poetry was blackout poetry. And that really kind of expressed research thoughts in a very different, creative way that was, it was stimulating for sure. So that was very fascinating. And so, in one of the interviews that you've recently given, you did say that you do consider poetic inquiry to be a feminist methodology. So could you elaborate on that for us a little bit? How does it specifically address your work on gender and society?
Yeah, so when I think about poetry or using poetry in research or even in the classroom, I think it's a feminist methodology for a few reasons. So one of the things about feminist methodology is, kind of paying attention to ethics. I mean, we might argue that all research is really about ethics, but, having, a strong sense of ethics. There's a strong sense of needing to be reflexive, right, and reflexivity in that work, as well as aims of social justice. And if you ever talk to any poets, poets are always using poetry for political aims and for social justice means. And what I found is that I can make my work, in some ways, the ethics really up front when I use poetry. In terms of, how it helps me address, issues of gender, for instance, that are upmost in my work. I mean, that's one of the things about feminist methodology too, right? Is we're highlighting, right, some of how assumptions we make about gender and how it functions in society. And there's a lot of things that I'm angry about, right? And poetry to me is the language of emotion. And so therefore it's a good way of using, right, that emotion as kind of a powerful tool. And it's a good way to express some of that anger in in forms that are more powerful.
Right. No, that's really, I love that you said that you're so angry about so many things, because that's really so, I want to say since a certain specific year, but honestly, it has been before that. And because you talked about that, and because we're talking about art as well, could you elaborate a little bit on the pink hats that you made for the Women's March in 2017? I think that's kind of when this was going on. I just thought of it because specifically, I think that became a part of your research as well.
Oh, when we were making the pink hats and then some of the critiques of that. So yeah, I had there were, because I knit also, right? So this is something that also is part of my creative practice. And I was I think there were a lot of us that were knitting these hats for some of these women's marches. But then at some point, some of the local women's marches, there were, calls that white women had somehow, or not somehow, but they were kind of overtaking, some other people's voices. And I started doing a collaborative project with a poet, essayist, a friend of mine who lives in Pittsburgh and is director of creative writing there at Chatham University. And in her local march, they ended up having an alternative one because some of the women of color in the community said, this has been taken over, this ideas of white feminism aren't speaking right for everyone. And so then we started to critique some of, what do some of these pink hats represent, and trying to critique notions of white feminism. So how is it that you can actually make your feminism intersectional? And so we had done a poetic piece, kind of a feminifesta about that. So making sure to kind of even think about being reflexive about our own role as white feminists, right, in the women's marches, and how is it that we can critique that and not buy into white feminism, but to make our feminism more intersectional. So that was a way that we were able to use poetry through that project, but also the idea that then you have to listen to some of the critiques, right? That's some part of some of the ethical practice.
Right. No, and I think that lends very nicely to the idea of reflexivity that you just talked about in your previous answer, right? Like constantly not just questioning others, but ourselves, what are our roles in these big movements that we have. So thank you for that. So far we've talked about methods within a little bit of an academic, teaching environment, but I want to widen the scope a little bit. Humanities, are branches of knowledge that concern themselves with human beings, culture, or with analytical and critical methods of inquiry. And it values the kind of the unique ability of the human spirit to express itself, right? And I think that really closely relates to the ways in which you approach academic research, focusing on our ability to express ourselves beyond our words. Especially, like we talked about, how academic research is commonly understood as aggressive, difficult to approach. I couldn't get my mom to read any of my research articles. But do you think that poetic inquiry has the ability to reach out to that layperson at large? Could we potentially bring research down to, and I say masses, I basically mean like non-academic folks, right? So people like my friends, if they ever want to read something by me.
Oh, yeah. Poetry is definitely art for non-academics. People respond to poetry. And I'm not just talking about poetry that you see in literary magazines. So what I'm referring to is think about spoken word poetry and poetry slams. And the fact is that poetry is vital in all of our lives. And I want to, Audre Lorde, is famously, wrote that poetry is not a luxury. And in fact stated, and I want to have this quote, poetry is not only dream or vision, it is the skeleton architecture of our lives. So we write poetry to understand our lives, express our experiences. And it's really a shame that the education system, at least in the US, I can't speak for anywhere else, tends to, kill some of our love, right, for poetry. I remember when my daughter was younger, sometimes she would, the wordplay, she would just make up, right, rhymes and verses that were very poetic. And in fact, poetry is actually more popular than ever. Every so often, somebody will make some treatise like, oh, poetry is dead. But then you start to see, we have poetry slams, spoken word is very much alive. Think about Instagram poets. It tends to kind of resurge too when we think about political turmoil, right? Mm-hmm. So, which is, it's no surprise that we often go after the poets and the artists first, right? Because, they have a lot of truth to tell. So I would say that it's definitely is part of our daily lives. Right. And, it's very vital. And I will tell you that, my parents also didn't read my dissertation or any of that, but a lot of the work where I have used poetry in those presentations, I get emails and comments all the time where people are like, oh, that really spoke to me, or right. So it does get read more.
No, that is, I love that the poets are the first ones to get attacked, the artists and the poets.
Always.
And And I guess that, kind of, I'm wondering if in academia itself, I know that we have the the conference with the qualitative research inquiry that happens every year. And so there is like a specific spot for it to be recognized, right? But I'm wondering how seriously do other academics take it? Because we know that academia is full of hierarchies, right? And so we have very strict notions of quantitative is so strict and qualitative is like more fluid. And so where does poetry feature in all of that? Does it get judged? Is it taken seriously? And because I know that I have now attended a couple of panels in the National Communication Association conference, but it's still very much on the margins.
Well, I think it depends on what circles you're at. There's a group of us, and it kind of rotates, and that have been getting together every other year since 2007 for the International Symposium on Poetic Inquiry. And so and these are folks from education and communication and science and math. And so there are spaces for it. I see more spaces in journals, right, for that. There's a newish autoethnography literary magazine that I've just now become the executive poetry editor. And so, there's a space, right, and that's the idea of, poetry as autoethnography, right? So there are spaces for it, and there are many ways that you can now make arguments. So, I mean, I know that I have, a book in the second edition so if you ever need to say, is this legitimate? There's a lot of folks that you can cite in that way. And so again, poetic inquiry is a form of art-based research. And so there are in the Association for Education Researchers, there's a whole subdiscipline of art-based researchers, right? Poetry, right, falls under there. In communication, we don't have it as much, but I know that I'm presenting a lot of things on poetic inquiry. I just had an article that came out in the Journal of Family Communication on like setting the agenda, and it's about using poetic inquiry as family research methodology, right? So it's starting, right? It has been, in our journals for quite some time, but I do think that there's more spaces for it to be legitimized.
No, absolutely. And you had briefly mentioned about poetry not being taken seriously in school. I also grew up in a system where it was fun to read for literature, but if you started writing poetry, you were just like, oh, you're just having some fun, or it wasn't never a part of the curriculum as such. Excuse me. And so obviously to get to that level of legitimacy, it's going to take some work, but I congratulations on all of those things, by the way. I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I did have one more question about, so you did say that poetic inquiry is autoethnographic, right? But I remember reading this work about...
It can be. It does. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to always be autoethnography.
Right. Okay. But yeah, sometimes it is, sometimes it is not. And so what happens, so like we read this work about refugees crossing the border, and well, I guess my curiosity, and this is a question of ethics too, right? So what happens, or how do you weave poetry, or when you weave poetry from refugees you have interviewed, or specifically vulnerable populations that you've interviewed? So my question is twofold here. How do you view creating your poetry out of other people's words? How do you approach that? And second, obviously, this is a theme also in your Poetic Inquiry, a Social Justice and Political Response book. How does poetic inquiry address identity, communication, and connection within society?
Okay, I can tackle those two. So there is a rich history of using poetry to represent interviews and participant lives. And there's a few ways that you can do this. So some researchers will do what they call found poetry, which is where you take exact words or phrases from an interview, participants' words, and you arrange them into poetic forms and lines. And so that is, you're using participants' exact words, right, to create poetic forms. And some would say, okay, that's one way to deal with some of the ethics. So here's their words, right? And I haven't really altered anything. It's just the way that I've arranged them, or I mean, of course, you are selecting, right, what to put down. And so that's one way, and I've done that, myself. You also can, have a little bit more liberty, or maybe take some more creative license and use the interviews, right, for some inspiration, and maybe create some other poems kind of based on the interviews. And so that's another way to do that. In terms of the ethics of that, you could do things like give those poems back to participants to write for some of their feedback. You can also, in some ways, make it clear that, okay, so this is based on some participants, but it's always still going to be the researcher's interpretation. So, there are some, power dynamics that way, but I've found too with some poetry that it's actually a more nuanced way to present someone's story, right? Rather than just using quotes. And so it's through those nuances, I feel like many times I can give a richer portrait of their lives. And so I find that to be in some ways, a bit more ethical.
That's, yeah. I mean, and I guess, like, yeah, and I completely understand. I think this was the one question that I had specifically, because when I tried to tackle this method, and I was thinking about some of the interviews that I wanted to do, and I was like, well, I am coming from a big position of privilege here. How do I think it was a personal discomfort, but I was not feeling like, okay, should I turn this into poetry or not?
Well, I've been doing is I have an example that might also help to speak to these issues of ethics. So I just finished up a project where I had interviewed 31 older women. By older, it's like 60 plus. This was over 2 semesters, and I was collaborating with a colleague of mine in gerontology, but we were interviewing older women about their relationships across a life course. But we had students, and this is also the pedagogy piece, right, that comes in. So it have students in it was a relational communication class. These are graduate students, relational communication class and a research class, qualitative research class. Each one would sit in on an interview, but then what they would do is create a poetic portrait of the participant. And that is a representation of the participant's life experiences and stories in verse. Right? So they would, maybe make a series of poems. We workshopped them and talked about all this. But then what happened is they would gift the poetic portrait back to the participant. And so, and many times students would use, exact words that came up from, interviews, but it's like the way they arranged it or what they chose to focus on. And here we're talking about, hour to hour and a half interviews where participants were talking. Mm-hmm. And, I would say on the whole, the participants, that was kind of some of the reciprocity there. So yes, we're going to be thinking about your stories and what does this tell us about the relationships and older women, but also here we are kind of gifting some words back to you in kind of a celebration of your life. So, so I don't know. I think that speaks some to the ethics, and I'm actually going to be doing something similar to this in Bowling Green, Ohio this fall, where I'm going to be doing some similar like life history interviews with older women, and we're going to record them so the oral histories will be in the archive for everyone to access, but I'm also going to be doing poetic portraits that will also be in the archives of participants' stories.
Right. And I mean, I'm talking about poetic inquiry here, but I mean, all of our research is basically this, right? Like we talk to people and we just like shun them afterwards, or I think one of the words that I learned in Bowling Green actually was the idea of calling them co-researchers instead of participants,
Yep.
which kind of it will not bridge the gap. I feel obviously not, but I think I was just curious how we do that in excuse me, poetry a little bit. And so my second question was kind of specifically looking at academically published poetry and how it fosters, and again, this was a theme in your book as well, how it fosters identity and community through the work that you do and other researchers that use this.
I think one of the real strengths of poetry is that it can be nuanced, but it's also you use specifics, like specific details. Often as poets, we'll talk about, it's through, you've got to use very specific kinds of details there, but it's through that then you actually can make universal claims. And it's through those details that then people recognize something in the poetry, either about themselves or it somehow resonates with them. And that's how those specifics become universal. But it's also then how it's evocative too. And that's also how then sometimes these, poetry becomes a call to action. Right. And hence that's some of the, the social justice aims and the political aims of poetry. And so I'm going to tell you that, and I've read some of the poems. I actually did a series of poems from these interviews we had done with older women. And, I could just tell you some about the stories, but then if I read you some of the poems, that tends to evoke more and tell you more about those stories than in a prose form. And so that's how I think that it works, is that it's a lot more evocative.
I love that. Oh, it's again fascinating. So we have mentioned this briefly, but I want to kind of focus on this bit a little bit because your book again also does explore this in a lot of depth. So I want to talk more about poetic inquiry in academia specifically and social justice. Right, so from an academic, humanities, social sciences perspective, that's kind of what I'm interested in poetic inquiry's role specifically in social justice and in the poetic inquirer's role in social justice. What does it do? Because, and I think we've had this, in academic circles, we keep having these debates, right? Are you an activist or are you an academic? And so how does poetic inquiry, according to you, speak to that?
Well, I don't think those are mutually exclusive, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, first of all. But, as, I had mentioned before, poets have always used their work for political ends, right? And again, I think that's why often, we have political tension. Some of the funding for the National Endowment for the Arts went away. I mean, that's it. And it's because, poets are often speaking truth in ways that, those who wield power find threatening. And, poets have always spoken out. So when we think about wars, I'm thinking about, poetry from World War II. There was like quite a scene, right, where poets, or if we think even, now, like with Black Lives Matter. And I'm thinking of Terrence Hayes, if anybody's not looked at some of the work, who really talks about Black experience in the U.S. and actually tends to use a lot of formal forms, right? Like sonnets, for instance. And Ocean Vuong, who is one of my favorite contemporary poets, who writes a lot about being gay and also the immigrant experience, right, in the U.S. And actually, Ocean won a MacArthur Genius Grant, I think like 2 years, right? Maybe it was 2 years ago. So, we have poets, right, and who teach, I just forgot where Vuong is teaching, but right, these are also poets who are, in the academy, right, as well, but they're using their poetry, right, for, as part of social activism. And, the idea is that, when we speak the truth of some of these experiences, right, the poetry resonates, and that might, either even if it's small things, like maybe that gets someone to recognize something about their own experience and maybe speak out, or I don't know, maybe it gets someone to donate, right? Some money
Right.
to a political cause.
Right. No, that's fantastic. I mean, I think that because you talked about calls to action, a lot of our academic work stops right before that, right? Like we talk a lot about, okay, this is what is wrong, here's what represent. I had somebody ask me this question at CSCA recently where they were like, well, you're talking about Bridgerton and race. How do you suggest we improve it? I was like, well, if network executives want to talk to me about it, I'm happy to like give them specific calls to action. But I think that's what poetry does. It gives you, here's what you can do. I love that. Absolutely love that. One of the things,
Because it's all about possibilities. Like for me, that's what I think about. I think because it's nuanced and because it holds both and, right? It's very good at holding dialectical tensions, right? In ways that other forms aren't. So when you have such a capacious form that can hold so much, it's like they're not necessarily going to be easy answers, but it actually can, right? It can be both and it can show all of those tensions, and then maybe there's possibilities for action.
yeah, and definitely leaves a lot more room for relatability, which I think that so many, again, like kind of flagging again the thing that I said, that so many people don't feel like they can relate to academic research. You're all talking about fancy methods, fancy stuff. Oh, what about the person who may be getting affected by it? So no, for sure, a lot more relatability to that form as opposed to just our regular graphs and charts and the all of the in vivo analysis that we end up doing.
Right.
But yeah, one of the things that you've written is what I believe is in the power of poetry as relationship research, and you've demonstrated that in a lot of your work. But what would you say to researchers who, or how can researchers who don't want to use poetic inquiry in research work, how can they implement it still in their daily lives, whether it's teaching, whether it is their work? I mean, do we see poetic inquiry in industry forms, in industry at all, for example? I feel like, especially for our students, right? Like they're studying so many things from us. Maybe they do not want to become academics like us. They go into the industry, take various corporate jobs. Could they still stay with this? How would they incorporate it in their lives?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I had mentioned before the popularity of Instagram poets.
All right. Right.
So, or, poetry readings in the community. But I mean, I think that it's really, vital. So they can find it in, a lot of ways in their communities. And even if they don't, if it's like, more kind of academic readings of poetry, they might like slam poetry, right? There's all kinds of, in many communities, right? There's also, all kinds of spoken word poetry. And that might speak more
Right.
to some
Yeah.
folks.
No, I love Instagram poets. I'm kidding you not. Maybe like 2 weeks ago, there was a whole discourse on Twitter about Instagram poets.
Yep.
And it was all about, are they legitimate? And I'm like, it's still expression, you know?
And my thought is, if it speaks to you, who's policing like what's legitimate poetry? I mean, I certainly have my own aesthetics and the kind of poetry that I like.
Right.
But if people are enjoying, like, why would I want to keep people from enjoying it? And if they're expressing themselves, and maybe, that speaks to them, like, let's not, and that's part of the elite, the calling some academics elitist is like,
Right.
okay, well, so now I'm gonna, I'm not interested in policing that. I don't personally do spoken word poetry. I kind of,
Right.
would, but I love it. Right.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
also, and I was just talking to a researcher. I was recently just in Dublin giving a poetic workshop to some, the Royal College of Surgeons, and but it was some social behaviorists, what is it, positive health, right, for these social behavioral scientists. And but one of them was thinking, oh, well, how is it that I can do some like health education, et cetera? And we were talking and said, well, maybe having some of the young people's stories made into spoken word. We were like, that's probably what would resonate, more with them. And so then it's like maybe some of the educational pieces will be like in spoken word.
I love that. Yeah. And again, it demonstrates the ability of this particular methodology to find itself in all fields. You don't have to stick
Yeah.
to communication, right?
Right.
And there is so much policing of poetry, what Rupi Kaur does, or what
Yeah.
Instagram Poets does. Like,
Yep.
I yesterday night I was scrolling through it, and Rupi Kaur has suddenly come into the Twitter discourse once again, and the way that she performs her poetry, and
Yeah.
I may not enjoy it, I may not agree with it, but I feel like, okay, that if I don't, then I'm going to put it aside and I'm not going to engage with it. But there are people just kind of, they are devouring her with just
Yes.
the most absurd things. Like, you cannot do, why not? Who decided that this is what poetry is going to be like? And so I love that, it finds an expression in academia as well. This was such a lovely conversation, Dr. Faulkner. I really appreciate you talking with us. Do you have any parting words to our listeners? Anything that you would like? Oh, a memorable final thought that you would like to leave?
Yeah. I would say just don't be afraid of poetry, right? Read it, write it, speak it, go listen to it. So I think poetry is powerful.
It is. It is. It definitely is. It was lovely talking to you. Always is.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you being here, and I hope that all of our viewers, listeners, audience members also enjoyed listening to you. And you are available on social media if you would like to. Sandra Faulkner. People can find you online on your website, on the
They
BGM
can.
website.
Yes, absolutely.
And you have a rich body of work that I am slowly going through now that I'm trying to, okay, let's see, now that I've finally done with my dissertation stuff, I can look at other things too. But just some excellent work on poetic inquiry, if any of our listeners want to go ahead and have a look at that. So yeah, thank you so much, and
Thank you.
have a great rest of your week ahead.
Thank you.